Welcome to Invisibly Unwell. I'm your host, Paige Lavelle. I've spent the past 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder. I've worked hard to get where I am professionally, but there's a side of me that few are aware of. I am also an autoimmune warrior, an eating disorder survivor, an author, and now a podcast host. My goal here is to educate and empower high-achieving women navigating autoimmune conditions and other chronic illnesses, who at the same time are also dealing with challenges that all high-achieving women face, like disordered eating, perfectionism, and people-pleasing. Invisibly Unwell is what I wish I had at the start of my journey. You are not alone. I hope my story and the stories and expertise of my guests will provide you with knowledge and ideas and empower you to share your own story and advocate for the life you've worked so hard to build. Quick disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Today's guest is actually making her second appearance on the podcast, and I could not be more grateful to have her back. It is Dana Monsees, licensed dietitian-nutritionist and certified nutrition specialist. She believes true health and healing go so much deeper than food and exercise. In addition to her work with clients, she is also the co-host of one of my favorite podcasts called the Wholehearted Eating Podcast. She, along with her co-host, Christina Hoyt, believe you deserve to have a joyful relationship with food and your body, even if you have chronic health conditions or symptoms that just will not quit. My favorite thing about speaking with Dana is how knowledgeable, honest, and just approachable she is. She is an expert on so many things, and she will completely blow up a lot of the misinformation that is out there that is bombarding us on our social media feeds. And she does it in a way that makes you feel like you're just sitting down over a cup of coffee with your friends. I loved having this conversation with her, and I know that you will take something of great value away from it today. Great. Well, thanks so much for coming back, Dana. I really appreciate it. I got quite a few follow-up questions and people that wanted to know more about your expertise. So yeah, super pumped to have you on the show again.
Happy to be here. Happy to answer any questions. You know, I can talk to the wall for hours and hours. So whatever we need to go into, I'm happy.
I do. So one thing that I've recently had to incorporate, and it's funny because I talked at length about how I had to be less restrictive with my food rules in the past. For anyone listening who hasn't listened to the first episode that I had with Dana, I talked about how I began restricting gluten, dairy. I could go on for a list of like 10 things that I wouldn't allow myself to eat. I think I wasn't allowed to eat a whole lot more than I was allowed to eat. And it became problematic for me because I had a history of disordered eating. And I know that's something that many women can deal with. Many women can resonate with and have been through some level of that disordered behavior. So I, in the past, allowed myself to have what I would call, I know this is not a healthy word, by the way, like cheat food, cheat meals. And I would have bagels or pizza. And that turned into, I just ate gluten whenever I wanted. Now, I don't have celiac. So to an extent, I can, eat gluten. I'm not going to become nutritionally deprived because of the effect it has on my body. But I've recently learned that there's some inflammatory concerns. And it's something I haven't talked about publicly much, but for me, it's affected some fertility issues. And it's something that I find is, as I've opened up about it with friends, family, and my network, somewhat common that people have had to go on these more restrictive diets when they're looking to have a family, or if they're just concerned about inflammation in their body in general. I think the term inflammation, as I'm sure you could speak about, gets thrown around a little too much. So what two-pronged question for you here, my very long-winded question. I'd love to actually first speak about the inflammation and a lot of the misinformation out there. And then I would love to dive into, if you do have a history of restriction and black and white thinking and disordered eating, a lot of us fellow perfectionists out there, any recommendations you have for incorporating certain restrictions, if it's really for the benefit of your health, and how to do that in a way that is healthy and in a way that you at least set out with the intention of not triggering a lot of those unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah. It's hard. So let's do the inflammation.
To put it mildly.
Let's do the inflammation piece first. So like, what is inflammation? inflammation is actually a healthy and expected and normal response to something that the body thinks is like not supposed to be there. And inflammation is actually a healing process. So if we think about if you get a virus, if you get a cold, if you hit your hand with a hammer, if something like that, what inflammation in quotes actually is more red blood cells and white blood cells and immune cells going to that area to deliver more nutrients, and platelets are showing up and all these different things so we can heal what has happened. So I think inflammation in general, and the way that it's kind of thrown around in the world as it is like it's a demon, basically. It's like there can never be any inflammation, and inflammation is always bad, and we have to do every single thing in order to prevent any kind of encounter with inflammation whatsoever, which is actually not what we want. Just like most things in life, it's when things become too much that it's a problem. And inflammation is a huge component of autoimmune disease. And, we can go on a lot of different branches, two-pronged approach, probably like 27-pronged approach here when we're talking about autoimmune disease and inflammation. But when we're thinking about when autoimmune disease is either first detected or kind of starts spiraling before you get your diagnosis, or if you're having a situation where the autoimmune disease is no longer in remission, if you're having a flare or something like that, there's almost all of the time going to be some kind of inflammatory component to that. Now, it's going to be individualized based on the person, based on the autoimmune disease, based on the health history of what triggers that inflammation for people. And if it already has been triggered, what are the things that we can do to help either bring down or manage that inflammation? For certain conditions, it's medications. For certain conditions, like for celiac disease, for example, you have to remove gluten. For other people, there are other things that we can do gut-wise and start to see what are the long downstream effects of this flare or inflammation. And inflammation is something that can trigger other components of autoimmune disease. And so it really is like a 27-pronged, what is inflammation? What does it do? And I would say one of the most common things that we're seeing in the recent couple of years is inflammation is really at a root of really every chronic health condition in some way, shape, or form, or symptoms or something like that. Like I work with a lot of people with women's health issues and then also gut issues. The caveat is I don't really do fertility stuff, but when we're talking about like PCOS, endometriosis, thyroid stuff, a lot of other stuff like that, and all of that can be traced back to a lot of the time inflammation, or I would say disruption in some system in the body that's supposed to be working well. And that can, of course, come from a lot of different avenues. Some are related to lifestyle, some are related to physiology, structure, function of the body. We can really go everywhere with inflammation.
So the second question was around if you do have to incorporate some sort of restriction of any kind. Like in my case, it's getting back off gluten. That makes it sound like it's an addiction. I don't mean it that way.
Some people think about it in that way, to be fair.
It's true. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, I think in some respects, I can understand, like I've definitely felt addicted to sugar and things of that nature. But I try to be mindful of separating that from like very serious addictive behaviors. So when you have this history of very restrictive tendencies and you kind of latch onto these rules and you take it a little far, and if that's something you've gotten to a point that you're pretty self-aware about that tendency, do you have any recommendations for how to take a healthy approach if you are presented with something that for a variety of health reasons you do have to try to eliminate?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to flip the question on its head. And I will always ask, especially with people who have a history of whether it's disordered eating, eating disorder, or just people who have a history of restricting things, chronic dieting, following all these different protocols and everything, is do we actually have to do an elimination in order to get the results that you want? So for example, I feel like a lot of the things that are in complementary, alternative, functional medicine that we kind of just generally accept as true need to be questioned. So for example, this is funny because I was just doing research on this earlier today, is when we're talking about hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, celiac disease, and basically the question of like, do we need to eliminate gluten? in order to experience remission and all these different things. What's really interesting is like the main book that most people cite saying, oh, you have to eliminate gluten in order to achieve remission for Hashimoto's or really manage hypothyroidism or anything like that. All of the studies in that book actually point to celiac disease. There are not a lot, and I have since gone into a lot of other studies on this. And really, the evidence is very, very sparse in terms of studies that have been done on people who have hypothyroid, but not celiac disease, and Hashimoto's, but not celiac disease. And so what's really confusing is a lot of the studies that have been done on Hashimoto's, they have not yet tested those people for celiac disease. And so it's like, okay, well, when we do a gluten-free trial, are we seeing better quality of life, but actually not necessarily better thyroid numbers, which is interesting, when we cut out gluten? And is it because they're digestively feeling better, or is it because the Hashimoto's is going in remission? And have those people been even tested for celiac disease? So this is where it starts to get really, really confusing, right? So the first thing that I would say is you want to go to a source that can help you like sort through, okay, given my specific set of circumstances, do I need to do X, Y, and Z elimination? Because another example here is the autoimmune protocol, which I think we have talked about before, is when you're eliminating a whole laundry list of things. But what they've found, and in clinical practice, many people have found that there are certain autoimmune diseases for which certain eliminations are really helpful, but for other ones, not so much. So for example, in rheumatoid arthritis, it's pretty common that people don't do well with nightshades, so like peppers and tomatoes and eggplant and even sometimes potatoes. But that's not necessarily the case for someone who has Hashimoto's or who has celiac disease or who has all these other things. So what you really want to do is get as granular as possible. And then to actually answer your question, if we have checked all those boxes and let's say you've done stool testing or you've done something that shows you that you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity or you do have celiac disease or, any of these other examples where it's like, I personally notice that I do feel way better if I eliminate X, Y, and Z, hopefully as little eliminations as possible. That's the first place that I'm going is how can we minimize the number of things that we're cutting out? And I think the other thing that we want to avoid is when we have a history of perfectionism, crossover with eating disorders, disordered eating, chronic dieting, other stuff like that, we can remember that unless you have something like celiac disease or a food allergy, this doesn't have to be 100% of the time. You have to avoid every single potential cross-contamination ever or you're going to die, right? It's different than that. So what you can think about it as, it's what you do most of the time that's helping you to feel better is what matters the most. And so if you do have to do some kind of restriction, that also doesn't mean that you can't eat gluten-free things. For example, bagels and bread and, all of this other stuff. And I think that's actually really important to note for people who do have a history of eating disorders and disordered eating and really latching on to stuff like restriction, because it's very common to be like, okay, well, if I'm cutting out gluten, then I can only eat, quote, real food. And we're only doing fruits and vegetables and protein. And I might as well cut out grains and like all of this other stuff. And now you're basically back to strict paleo, which can be really, really triggering for people. So I would say if you're kind of dipping your toes into the water, it's do the lateral shifts first, right? If you eat bread or you eat bagels or you eat, whatever, try the gluten-free bread, try the gluten-free bagels, try the gluten-free substitutes. Now, depending on the person and depending on the product, because there's quite a lot of gluten-free products out there now, some people don't feel great digestive-wise with different flours that are used in gluten-free products or different sugars that are used in gluten-free products, right? So that's a whole nother can of worms. And so then you might just say like, oh, well, I'm just not going to eat them then. But when we're trying to be as the least restriction possible, if truly what you're looking at is saying, for, let's say all of the evidence shows for you personally, listener or Paige, that when you cut out gluten, you feel significantly better. That doesn't mean that you have to cut out gluten-free grains. That doesn't mean that you have to cut out, gluten-free bread or gluten-free whatever, right? If we're looking at the gluten peptide or the gluten protein, because that's what gluten is, if your immune reaction or whatever digestive or any thyroid reaction that you have is specifically related to the gluten protein, that is the thing that we're pulling out. It doesn't have to be all the accoutrements that go with the gluten as well. So that would be the kind of first and very tentative step that I would recommend. And then you just kind of build from there. And the big difference between this and what we used to do before is we used to just jump wholly in. It's like, oh, I'm going to eliminate all the things. I'm going to be 100% perfectionistic about it. I can never eat gluten again. All this stuff. It's very all or nothing. And from this perspective, we're trying to go the path of least resistance and least extreme. You can always build your way into more restrictions if you absolutely need to. So for example, if you eliminate gluten, but you're still doing the gluten-free breads or crackers or, all these other things, and you're like, I still feel pretty bad. You can always start to take away one thing at a time. But when you have a history of a complicated relationship with food, if you don't want to re-trigger that, you have to tread very, very carefully. And of course, with this, I would always, always, always recommend that you work with someone who can help check in with you along the way and someone who you can be very, very honest with, right? Because if you're starting to do this and like 3 days in, you're like, ooh, I know I'm supposed to be doing this gluten thing, but like I'm feeling really triggered and like I feel like I'm going to binge on something. We need to take 5 steps back at a minimum. There are other ways to go about this as well. It doesn't always have to be a restriction. And that goes back to the first point that I made is like, does it have to be restriction? Does it have to be this specific restriction, right? Because there's other things that we can do as well. But I mean, once you've gotten to the point, like it sounds like you have, Paige, where it's kind of like no stone left unturned and we've arrived back at this point, there is a way to do it. You just have to be very deliberate and know yourself. And I would highly recommend checking in with someone to see how you're doing. And so you can do a little bit of a more objective self-assessment rather than just writing it out on your own.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I encourage this for anyone else listening, if you have the resources and there are more affordable options available. But knowing that I had to give that up, began seeing a therapist just to talk through anything that brought up. And so far it's been going pretty well, which also makes me realize I'm a lot farther along in that journey of disordered eating and those tendencies, but I didn't want to take any chances. So I do appreciate you saying that because I think it's pretty critical for anyone who has had that experience in the past, because those things don't just poof, go away. It takes a lot of continued work and addressing them. Another thing I wanted to bring up around inflammation while we're on the hot topic. I know I've personally shifted the way that I work out, and I know you've changed a bit of the way that you tackle that. I used to be, and I'm not knocking them as workouts, but someone with my very complicated health history, I used to love HIIT workouts. Shocking for being a type A overachiever, but exactly. I would go and I just loved getting sweaty, going all in. And it was my time to just, when you're going that hard, it's a distraction. And I know people that love it, but for me, I would go and that would just turn my brain off because all I could think about was like, oh my God, I don't know if I can make it to the end of this class. And I was in great shape from a purely aesthetic perspective. But I began to learn more and more that they don't recommend if you have an autoimmune disease, or in my case, multiple. I had Lily Stairs on the podcast, who refers to herself as a triple threat, which I love because I'm also a triple threat of autoimmune diseases. If you have an autoimmune disease or many, it's recommended, at least by physicians I've worked with, to not go to those extremes when you're working out, and to do things that are maybe slower resistance training, yoga, getting my steps in. Not that I'm saying you have to get X amount of steps in, but I know I feel better when I move. And sometimes just walking my dog for a while is a great way for me to move, especially if I'm feeling fatigue. So I was curious if you can shed any insight into that inflammation piece as it relates to HIIT workouts and to people who might be struggling with those chronic illness conditions that that applies to.
Yeah, definitely. So what people don't want to hear is all exercise is inherently inflammatory. It just is. And whether you're talking about cardio health or you're talking about resistance training, or the way that your muscles build and grow is that there are tiny tears made in them during exercise. And then when you are refueling with food, they are then allowed to repair and grow. So inherently, exercise is inflammatory. This is all kinds of exercise, unless we're talking about probably restorative yoga. At the same time, that doesn't mean that exercise is bad, right? So going back to the inflammation as a concept is not bad. It's just when you're doing too much of it, or when you have too much inflammation and it's too frequent and it's chronic and it's not allowed to go away, that's going to cause a lot of issues. So when you have, using it inherent again, when you have autoimmune disease, we are inherently inflammatory people. We have a predisposition to inflammation, or there's a lot of inflammation that kind of led us to this point. And when we're looking at exercise itself, not only the kind of physical aspects of exercise can be inflammatory, but especially with something like HIIT workouts, CrossFit, cycling, interval running, all this other stuff, they're also what I call very cortisol dependent, which means your adrenal hormones and your nervous system is like, wow, what is going on? But that is what you need in order to get through those workouts, which is one of the reasons why people love it so much. Because if you are a person who is, we used to call them like adrenaline junkies, right? Now I think people call them like cortisol junkies. And if that's not a thing, that's a great podcast name that someone should definitely take. But especially these kinds of HIIT workouts, group exercise classes, CrossFit is a really big one, spinning, I would say, but we're not really talking about your like 10 to 15 minute, Peloton classes or other stuff like that. We're talking about like Soul Cycle and Zango Cycle and, these other things. Is when you're in that type of stressful situation, because exercise is also a stressor on the body and that therefore it produces cortisol. Cortisol is also one of those things where it's your primary stress hormone. It is literally the reason why humans have been alive for this long and around. And so it is life-saving, and it does get you out of life-threatening situations. However, cortisol is also released when you get a crazy email from your boss, when you are engaging in behaviors that are not great for your health, when you are, when you're having like a virus, or when you have an illness, or when you get injured, or when you're doing too much CrossFit or HIIT workouts or anything like that. Also, when you drink coffee on an empty stomach. But so the unfortunate thing is everyone who's alive in this world right now has cortisol in some degree, and that's not bad. But when you're constantly exposed to a very stressful lifestyle, and then maybe you also have an autoimmune disease and you have these food restrictions and you're trying to do these HIIT workouts and stuff, your bucket is so full that it's overflowing. And that much constant flooding of the system with cortisol is inherently inflammatory. So now we're putting inflammation on top of inflammation on top of inflammation, which is actually interesting, because then we try and do these things like take a bunch of supplements and restrict a bunch of foods and try and remove everything inflammatory from our lives. At the same time, we're doing these HIIT workouts and other things. And it's like, well, the scales are not balancing here. So like the advice that you have received, especially if you are flaring in an autoimmune disease, now is not the time to be doing HIIT workouts, especially really long ones. There is something to be said for, in the healing and recovery process. I talk about this a lot with burnout. It's not that there is zero place for interval training or HIIT workouts ever again in your life. It's just that you have to be very mindful and meet your body where you are. If for whatever reason you have a really hard time with your health at this point in your life, there's no point in filling up your stress bucket even more with something like exercise that is supposed to be beneficial for you, mental health wise, physical health wise. If it's taking away from your capacity, that's not what you need right now. So this isn't also to say you shouldn't be exercising, right? Because again, exercise is great for physical health, mental health, cardiovascular health, all the things. But we need to kind of reroute the way that we think about exercise, because for a lot of us perfectionists, who are very busy in our minds intellectually, but not emotionally, and we don't want to feel things, we turn to things like HIIT workouts or hour-long runs or Peloton classes or any of these things because we can just focus on the right here, right now, which is sometimes really, really hard for people to get out of their own head. And that's one of the times that they're able to do that. But right now, that's not the time for that. Now is the time for more restorative things. You can do some weight training, but we're not talking about like high rep sets or like going to a max or something like that. This is muscle stimulating activity. But yeah, I mean, I think this can also be really hard because if you are someone who is a type A perfectionist, which I think happens to be a lot of us who have autoimmune disease, we have always looked at those forms of movement not as exercise. So it's kind of like, oh, well, I could walk the dog, but like that doesn't count as a workout for the day. Or I could do restorative yoga, but that doesn't count as a workout for the day. Or even like light weight training or something. Us in our old brains would be like, no, that doesn't count. That's like a rest day or something like that. And I find one of the most important things with managing an autoimmune disease or really any chronic health condition where it feels like your body is constantly fighting you is we need a new way of looking at things. Because the workouts that we all used to do really are beating up our bodies. And, that's not to say you can't ever do those again. There can be a time and a place for that. But if you're in a time and place where you're trying to do all of these other interventions in order to get your flare under control or try to work with fertility or other things like that, we can't be constantly pushing ourselves to the limit. And at the same time, trying to, reduce the inflammation and try to, reduce these foods that we're eating or reduce all these other things because we're not balancing it out. It's kind of like, well, we're trying to do one thing over here and it sounds like you're trying to do the opposite thing over here. But I think we all need a little bit of a mindset shift around exercise, then reprioritizing restoration, relaxation, still movement, like getting your movement in because you don't want to feel stiff all the time. Movement is great for lymphatic drainage and making sure things are moving through your body. It's also great to make sure you have regular bowel movements every day. But that movement doesn't mean we're running 5 miles every day. Movement doesn't mean that you have to do a cycling workout. Movement doesn't mean that you have to do HIIT training. It doesn't mean, we need to kind of reshape what we think qualifies, quote unquote, as exercise, and really reprioritize things when you're looking at managing a flare or autoimmune disease in general.
No, I think that's an excellent point. I also have noticed something, I shouldn't say notice as if it's recent because this has been going on for quite a while, but on social media, you'll see people that are pushing a particular type of workout and will kind of say it's better for you than XYZ. And I personally have always taken the like what works for you.
Yep.
And what you're going to continue to do is great. For example, I love the reformer Pilates classes. They're absurdly expensive. I'm sorry, I'm not apologizing for that for anyone who runs those. They are absurdly expensive, but I enjoy them. However, I feel my best self and I continue it if I do like circuit weight training a few times a week. And then I walk or I do intervals on the treadmill. I'm not a runner. I'm never going to be a runner. I have come to accept this at age 38. I'm just not. I can do intervals all day, but I'm not going to run a marathon. It's not happening. So like, is there anything behind those people saying like, for example, like these low impact workouts are better for women? Or is it just people putting stuff out there, at least in your experience in training, that works for them, but you can't prescribe that to the general masses?
Yeah, this is something that I think goes for nutrition, supplements, exercise, really everything in life. If there's ever someone saying this is the one and only way and it's my way or the highway, they have no idea what they're talking about. Because there's literally no one thing that works for everyone. And that goes for supplements, that goes for nutrition. I mean, you could even say like in general, eating more fruits and vegetables is better for general health for people. Yeah. And there's people with severe bacterial overgrowth when they eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, they feel like absolute crap, right? So it's like there is an asterisk behind everything. Now, The hard thing is you can find someone on every end of the spectrum for this, right? You'll find people that are like, well, women should be doing more weight training. And then you'll find, other experts, quote unquote, that are like, women should not be doing weight training and women should be doing more cardio. And so it gets really, really confusing. On my podcast, we call this the nutrition jungle, specifically related to food, but it can be applied to exercise. It can be applied to supplements. It can be applied to all sorts of different health information. But in general, my thought is, if there's someone out there that's like, it's my way or the highway, either they're trying to sell you something, or they don't have a very broad range of people that they are talking to, and they're just really trying to talk to one very specific niche of people. But even then, it's kind of like, well, not everyone within that specific niche is going to fit exactly what you're talking to. You know what I mean? So yeah. I am a huge, experiment with different things and find what works for you. And then also know that what works for you in this season of your life is not necessarily going to work best for you in a different season of your life, based on what's going on with you, your family, work, travel, everything personal and health and all the other things. So I think that is what's hard. Again, going back to the perfectionist thing, is like, we just want a system and we want it to work, and we want it to work all the time. And we're like, I'm going to stick with this for my whole life because I have the answer. And unfortunately, it's not that easy.
No, absolutely. I mean, seeing even my parents in their 70s with having different physical abilities, having to shift. And an example for myself, I skied growing up as a kid, and then I ended up with limited scleroderma, which Raynaud's is the most impactful symptom that I have out of that. So anyone who doesn't know what Raynaud's, nope. Anyone who's not familiar, it's a circulatory issue that in my case is related to an autoimmune condition, and my hands turn white and then purple when I'm cold. And it's not a fun little art show. They really hurt.
Yeah.
You don't get circulation, or at that point, oxygen to your fingertips. So it makes winter activities very difficult. I live in Western New York, and a huge game they're all into here is paddle tennis, which is on this elevated heated platform, and there's a cage. It sounds really scary, but it's very,
I think I've seen it.
Like
it's kind of like pickleball, right?
Yeah. It's kind of like a cross, I guess, between racquetball and pickleball, a little bit of tennis. But you have these paddles, and it's in the winter, so the ground is heated, and they play even in the snow. But for me,
not for Paige.
even with gloves or mittens on, like 10 minutes in, I'm like, okay, my hands hurt too much. I can't do this. So it's having to have that acceptance and getting over the perfectionism and the people pleasing in certain situations where you have to be like, I have a limitation and I can't do it. And that's okay. I'm going to do something else and work on your other activities or whatever you want to do. Now I'm very excited that they now have the battery powered gloves and socks. And I might try skiing again, but we'll see. I feel like the last time I skied, I was like a teenager. So it'll be a very different experience at 38. When I fall down, it's going to be harder to get up. I'll do that. But yeah, just to give an example of having to shift like certain activities that you enjoy. And I know that will evolve. I have plenty of friends who, when they were pregnant, couldn't do their favorite types of workouts for a bulk of that for a variety of reasons. So I appreciate you touching on that. One thing that you did bring up a few times around I love the, do you call it the wellness jungle or the nutrition jungle?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The nutrition jungle. It's thriving out there in social media. One thing I notice, I get hit because I research these things and because I have the podcast and connect with a lot of people in the chronic illness space. I get bombarded with supplements to a degree that is alarming to me. I do incorporate a few things into my routine, but I learned a long time ago to stop taking fistfuls of all the things. I'm not even going to specify because it's all the things. And then one particular expert, and I use quotes as well, will tell you this is the greatest thing ever. And then you find out a month later from another expert that like, no, that's actually really bad. Do you have any advice for someone who's kind of early in their stage of looking into the nutritional and lifestyle change approach to their health instead of purely looking and I like to think they all should exist in harmony in the best situation. But maybe they're looking past just the medication and seeing, well, what else can I do to improve my health situation? Any advice when they're getting bombarded by the nutritional jungle?
Yes. Prune your social media feed is the first thing that I would do. No, seriously, because the nutrition jungle of what we talk about, and this is an exercise that I do with a lot of my clients when I first start out with them, is have them list out, and whether it's like on their phone, piece of paper, whatever, of like every single diet protocol, elimination thing, anything that you've been randomly told by like an aunt or a friend or something, like every single rule and should that you have around food. And that can be I did this when I was a teenager for weight loss, or my mom took me to Weight Watchers, or like I followed the paleo autoimmune protocol, or I've been doing intermittent fasting. It's like you list out all of these different things. And then it's no wonder that you are so confused, because if you combine all of those things, there's literally nothing left to eat, probably just like water. But then it's like, well, should it be alkaline water? Should it be mineral water? Should it be still water? Should it be tap water? Like, should it be all these different things, right?
I've gone through that debate myself as well.
It's so confusing, right? And so I mean, again, I would circle back to the advice that I had about exercise is if there's someone who's like, it's my way or the highway, and you're basically making yourself sick if you don't do this, you don't need that energy in your life. Just move them to the side, unfollow, mute, whatever you need to do, right? In general, you want to find someone who's going to be able to meet you where you are. And that is hard to do on social media, because those of us who are on social media, it's just kind of like we're like shouting out into a void, and then it's like, oh, let's see who shouts back in the comments section, but inherently on social media, you do have to be general to a degree, because you can never speak to just one person. You can speak to a group of people, or you can make like wild claims like a lot of these people do, but it's really hard to be super, super niche down and specific. And there's also no way to know exactly who you're talking to, even if you do have a certain niche. The first thing that I would do would be prune your social media feed. And anytime that you're following someone and something comes up and it feels like you either should be doing something or you shouldn't be doing something, also mute, unfollow, restrict, whatever you need to do. And I would not recommend getting your nutrition or supplement information from social media, because it is extremely hard to be nuanced on social media as well. There may be some doctors out there that are like, oh, you should take, X supplement for this, but there's always an asterisk after that, right? But unfortunately, in the world of wellness, there's all these people out here who are trying to sell diet plans, or trying to sell protocols, or trying to sell supplements, or trying to, everybody's trying to make money out here. The economy's hard, right? And I get it. But at the same time, I don't get that. So it's trying to figure out, how can you prune the information that you're getting? And also looking at the source of where that source is getting their information, right? And so this is kind of like one step removed. So say you're following Jane Doe influencer or something, and she's saying like, this is the way to eat, and these are the supplements you should take for Hashimoto's when you also have Raynaud's and all these other things. You're like, oh my God, that's me. I never thought that someone would also have all of this conjunction of autoimmune diseases just like me, right? And so it's very easy to be like, oh my gosh, I'm just going to follow everything that she says. But you also want to think about, where is she getting her information? Is she getting it from someone who was just like her and she's just kind of parroting what they said? Are they getting it from verified studies? Did they take a training program? Like where did they get their stuff? Because this is something that's super interesting, as I've been poking around more in autoimmune thyroid and gluten research and stuff like that, is so many of these like quote functional medicine websites, they make all these claims, but I'm like, where are the studies? They'll just make all these and the thing is, not all the claims are wild. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I could see that, but it's like 0 studies cited. Or my favorite is when like one website will just cite another blog or something in their sources cited. So it looks like they used research, but they're just citing another blog that didn't have any research on it. And I'm like, where are we all coming up with these assumptions that we just widely accept to be true, right? So the catch-22 of this is, some people are like, I don't want to do that much work. I just want to scroll through somebody's Instagram and be like, oh, here's all the things that I should do. And people are going to get so annoyed with me. But For something as specific as that, especially if you do already have an autoimmune disease, you've got to work with somebody, because trying to sort through all of this stuff on your own is a full-time job. Most of the people that come to me for my like free intro call that I do is they'll say like, I know so much about nutrition and I feel like I know exactly what I should be doing. And I've been trying to do that over the last couple of years and I'm still not feeling better. And one of the things that can happen is when you try to do everything and all of the advice that you found out there, or you're jumping from this for 3 weeks to this for 3 weeks and this for 3 weeks, you may have found something in there that would have been successful for you if you did it for 3 months. But at the same time, if you're not seeing the results that you want, and you can qualify that in, any way that is defining results or progress or lessening of symptoms or anything for you, why would you waste more money on, or more time or more resources on doing that thing? So the answer is prune your social media feed. Like, think about all of the different places that you are getting your information, and at minimum, just try to condense that. So not to say that you shouldn't be getting information from multiple sources, because I think it's important to be widely read so we don't just pigeonhole ourselves into one thing. At the same time, in the wellness and health and nutrition and supplements world, it's very, very easy to be overwhelmed by a lot of this stuff. So I can completely empathize with that.
Yeah. No, that's, I felt like you were talking to me when you're like, I talk to these clients and they're like, I think I know everything. I feel like if I just started and brain dumped, I would talk for several hours about just random things I have read, consumed. And then in addition to those unsubstantiated articles, I've also read the PubMed articles and everything that is actually substantiated. And there's stuff on both sides that are just extremely contradicting and leaves you in this just state of analysis paralysis.
Exactly.
So thank you for doing what you do and working with people. I think one of the things I've tried to share here, and then I share a lot in my book that I'm working on, which is mostly just a memoir of chronic illness and these invisible illnesses and tendencies that I think plague a lot of high achieving women, is we all have a unique health situation. We can relate, and I want to resonate with people because I don't think that a lot of women out there that might have just found out they have a chronic illness, or they're kind of just feeling off and they can't figure out what's going on. They also have a job. They also have things they want to keep up with. I feel like a lot of them don't realize that that's a lot more common. If they just opened up about it, that a lot of other women can relate. So I want to be relatable and resonate and feel like I'm adding value to people out there listening. I also can't stress enough on the flip side of that coin that every one of us have a certain set of personal circumstances that have impacted our physical, mental, emotional, and if we want to get a little into the woo space, like spiritual health, just we all come from a different place. We all have had different experiences. And even if one of my friends had the exact same diagnosis as I have, she might be able to sustain certain things that I wouldn't be able to sustain as far as diet and lifestyle changes. Or I've had friends with Hashimoto's, which I have, that have taken a certain medication that works well for them. I've taken the same one and I caused a lot of hair loss. So there's no one size fits all. And those are even like narrowed down specific examples of people who I know I have the same condition as. So when you see something blasted to an entire social media channel, it's concerning to put it mildly. And just when you see all of these people wanting answers and wanting to feel heard, and someone speaking to them and they're calling out the specific issues they have, and then they jump on that, assuming that thing's going to make them feel better. And it might help, but it's not going to fix everything.
Yeah, it actually really pisses me off because it's very predatory in a certain set of circumstances. And, we see this in like a lot of different spaces. Speaking of workouts, there's this new kind of trend that's going around that's like somatic workouts, basically. But they're...
Oh, yeah. They hit my feed all the time.
But so the thing that I think is, and it's funny because we're actually planning on recording an episode about this on Friday, so it's on my mind, but there are certain circumstances where someone will say, okay, well, I know what sells, for example, like weight loss sells, right? And when you are someone who is drawn towards these somatic therapies, in a sense, it's because you probably have a degree of dysregulation or trauma or something. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is an alternative to like the super intense HIIT workouts and all this stuff that's been like, basically burying me and my physical health. And it's like, oh my gosh, this sounds great. And, like releasing trauma, which like question mark, on like the science that they're actually using for that. And I'm not saying that the body doesn't store trauma. I do believe it does. But the issue with this is that there are people out there who are like, oh yeah, these somatic workouts for weight loss and whatever, which is very predatory towards these people who are trying to use these practices as a way to release trauma. And it's like the people who are marketing this are actually re-triggering that trauma. And so just watch out for predatory marketing. Is what I would say. And I also want to reiterate, it's extremely understandable why people would be drawn to, if like, say there's a influencer or practitioner or whatever out there that specializes in Hashimoto's and they're like, oh, everyone needs, this, and this. And you're like, oh my gosh, that could be the one thing for me. Of course, I understand why you're going in that direction, because when you're in the weeds of it and you're feeling awful, all you want is solutions. And you're like, I'm so tired. I just want someone to give me an answer. And at the same time, nutrition and supplementation and just general wellness is so incredibly individualized that I never want people to feel like if they tried some intervention and it didn't work, it's because you're broken, it's because it's your fault, because that is actually a narrative that does happen a lot of the time with people who come to me from different functional medicine practices and stuff. Is like, they went there because they're looking for an alternative to the traditional primary care model and everything. And they do all the elimination diets and everything like that. And they're like, I don't feel any better. I was sold thousands of dollars worth of supplements, and now I have fear around these like 20 different foods that I shouldn't be eating. And now you're back to square one, but you have more fear foods. And they also feel like there's something wrong with them, or it's their fault because they now have the tools or they have the knowledge of what they should be doing and what should work for them, but they've done it and it didn't work for them. They're like, well, maybe I just didn't do it well enough, or maybe it's something wrong with me. And it's never something that's wrong with you. If I give you a screwdriver and it's the wrong screw, it's not something wrong with you. It's because it was just the wrong tool. You just need something different. So it's complicated.
Essentially, just want to leave the message out there that if you've done one of these things, no one faults you. It's completely understandable. And if it didn't work, it's not because you didn't try or because you're not good enough or because you are not worthy of feeling better.
And we've all been there. Literally the reason that Paige and I are here is because we have been there. And we wanted to share our stories to make sure that people don't feel so isolated and feel so alone, because it can feel very, very isolating to have chronic health symptoms, an autoimmune disease, and the middle of the Venn diagram between eating disorders, disordered eating, perfectionism, people-pleasing, and autoimmune disease, which is like the niche right here, right? And that can feel very, very isolating. And we just want to make sure that people feel a little bit more seen because, we've been there and we're all in this little community together.
Yeah. It's funny. The more I do this, the more I'm like, I think it's this tiny community, but it's not very small.
Yeah. I mean, when you compare it to the rest of the world, it is, but it's also so much bigger than we think it is.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. But thank you so much. I feel like I can't believe that the time is up. I could keep talking to you for like hours about this. But thanks so much. I really appreciate you coming back. And then obviously wanted to take a second for you to share where people can find you. If they want to read more about you, listen to your podcast, work with you as a nutritionist.
Yeah. The podcast is Wholehearted Eating. We go into all of this stuff. We're doing a series right now on millennial body image. And then also interspersing with, of course, chronic health condition stuff, eating disorder stuff, everything like that. And we're always trying to take a more neutral nutrition, non-perfectionistic approach wherever possible. And I mean, if you want to find me, you can always find me on Wholehearted Eating. You can, if you just Google me, Dana Monsees, Monsees, you'll find my Instagram, you'll find my website, everything like that. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge.
Thanks for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Invisibly Unwell. If you like the show, I'd greatly appreciate if you followed it and if you left a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is that you're listening. This allows me to keep the show going and to continue to bring on incredible guests to share their stories.